sometimes. Right, I think. There we are. Right, we're live. Okay, so I've got a lovely stream set up today. We've got Josh Lewis from the Saving Elephants channel with us today, a classical conservative, someone who hopefully from the other side of the pond give us some interesting discussion about a few pertinent themes. How are you today, Josh?
I'm doing great. Hey, and it always warms my heart when I hear somebody from the UK refer to it as the other side of the pond also, because that's how we say it out here.
See, I probably lost some points with my fellow British folk now for saying that. No, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the Atlantic, compared to the other ocean, the Pacific is massive. Like, you can fill up an entire sort of image of the globe with just the Pacific.
Yes.
But, no, the Atlantic, quite a big thing. So I don't know who first coined the phrase "the pond," but
obviously meant in jest, but it is something that, it's insane that we live in such a world that I could, I'm here in the middle of the country, Oklahoma, right? And I could reasonably hop on a plane and be to you possibly within the day, whereas our ancestors would have taken a month and may not have made it alive.
Well, exactly, right? The horrors of scurvy in the high seas. Quite the scary one. Well, as lovely as it would be to talk the history of sailing and circumnavigating the globe, we've got a few themes for our conversation today. Obviously, the big sort of talking point, probably around the globe, there's not many places that it's not cropping up in some way, is the current direction of the USA, the Trump administration, the Make America Great Again crowd that has sort of come to prominence over the last few years. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about these sort of themes with you today, because for as much as I can read about it and hear people's views and such, and even sort of learn about it myself, I'm not in America and I'm not American. So from someone who is probably more to the right than myself, how would you say you're feeling currently about the state of things in the US at the moment?
Yeah, and for the benefit of the listener and the watcher, I'll just say, level setting. I am to your right? I'm not a socialist, I'm a capitalist, I'm a classical conservative. I am, however, very Trump skeptical. I am not happy with the current direction of the Republican Party. I have not been ever since 2016 when Trump first announced he was running. And I have been very, and that is part of, it says in my name down there, Saving Elephants. That's the podcast I host. That's the sort of tongue in cheek. I'm trying to encourage Republicans to get back to a more traditionalist route and to abandon this nationalist populist cult of personality that is Donald Trump. That being said, what you have asked is such a big question. I feel like any answer I could possibly give you would be inadequate. But I'll just say that I am equal parts disheartened, discouraged, upset with the direction of the country under Trump. However, I am also a little cautious. I don't want to say cautiously optimistic, but I am also a little reticent to join some of those who are anti-Trump, who see him as necessarily a disavowed, say, authoritarian figure who runs the risk of completely destroying the entire free market system, the country as it were, and always could be. I don't mean that I think that he has, I think he has dictatorial tendencies. I don't think he necessarily has the competency or the ability to bring about some of the things that he's often feared. And I also think, broadly speaking, that what we're dealing with now, not just in the United States, but in the entire Western world, is not a resurgence of, say, right radicalism, but a breakdown of trust in society and of fundamental trust in our institutions that currently manifests itself in America in the MAGA movement. But that doesn't necessarily mean the alternatives to MAGA are pure, right? Or are the best alternatives. I am not a Democrat. I have plenty of problems with the Democratic Party. And there are good Democrats, there are good Republicans, but we live in a moment in which our politics across the globe in the Western world, I think, is a very precarious, untrustworthy state, a place where the people just do not know where to go, who to trust. And that's a very dangerous place to live, because that's why you get a Donald Trump, is you get a guy that some people can trust and say, well, he's got all the answers because he hates the people I hate. And the solution is not just get rid of Donald Trump, because the problem is a lot deeper than that. And so I guess that's where, maybe to set some levels, that's where I'm at. I do not like Donald Trump. I long for the day that his brand would go away, but I don't think that fixes the problem. I think we're just at the beginning of a very big problem here.
There's a lot of that I would agree with, definitely. I mean,
sure.
I think obviously I'm coming at it from a slightly more left-wing perspective. I wouldn't call myself a conservative or a capitalist, but absolutely, I agree with the idea that people are disillusioned with general sort of mainstream Western politics. I mean, I always find it strange saying Trump's not mainstream because he's a billionaire and very much of it's not as though he sprung up from nowhere, right? But in the sense of conventional friend of the party, worked their way up from and representative to senator to around the political circus to then sort of given their time in the same way that you look at I wouldn't call myself a supporter of the Democrats in the sense of yes, these are my people, but you look at someone like Hillary Clinton, right, who in 2016 I imagine probably thought she was going to just take over from Obama and coast along to the next presidency, and the idea that my husband Bill Clinton, he was president and I've been around for ages, now it's my turn to leave the Democrats, right? Like Donald Trump wasn't someone like that, but obviously he's still a rich billionaire that wants to use the country to make a lot of money for themselves. But I can see definitely that that sort of narrative makes it sound like I'm saying you're just making stuff up, but I'm not trying to say that. Like narrative in the sense of there's lots of discontent, and amongst all this sort of chaos and uncertainty, groups like sort of the MAGA style nationalist, populist, really vitriolic stuff can arise, right? Where they've seen the opportunity, they've grabbed it, and now you've got all these bad faith actors and charlatans who really want to just make a lot of money off the chaos.
Well, and I'm not sure how much play this got overseas, but one of the things we're talking about here in the United States after the 2024 presidential election, you're familiar, I presume, with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, who no one would accuse of sharing Trump's, say, political policy prescriptions or ideologies. She was genuinely confused why so many people she had learned have voted for her and Donald Trump instead of Harris. And she made an effort to reach out to her supporters, say, why? What is it you see that's similar between myself and Trump, who I presume there is no similarities? And while I'm sure there was a lot of various answers, one of the things that seemed to ring true for a lot of people is you're both authentic. You're both different. You're both against the system. You're both outside the system, trying to... Donald Trump, you're right, in some ways is conventional, in some ways is part of the establishment, but in a lot of ways is not part of the traditional establishment we would think of either the left or the right. I mean, he began in 2016 by bad-mouthing every Republican who was on the debate stage with him. That's not something typically a Republican does if they're trying to get the nomination. And so I think what you're seeing is individuals who, they're not socialists, they're not capitalists, they're not conservatives, they're not liberals. They're just upset with the system. And they see in AOC and they see in Trump individuals who are also upset with the system that's going to do something. By golly, they're going to do something about it. They're authentic. I can trust these people because they speak like I do. They understand it at, say, a visceral, personal level, this sort of distrust I have. That can lead to good things. It almost never does, though. It almost always leads to an individual who claims, well, I hear you, give me power. And rarely in history does that ever work out well for anyone.
Well, exactly, right. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like the political language that sort of the last 30 years of neoliberal general consensus politics have sort of fostered, have made. It's like when you see a politician's tweet a lot of the time, you can tell that it's been cultivated through a PR department, not PR, like a social media relations team have taken political figure X's phone, drafted something that sounds nice, but it's very obviously not something someone would say, and then tweeted it out, and then there's a confusion as to why people aren't necessarily swayed by it. Whereas game show host Trump, who has been interfacing in formats that you have to be marketable and entertaining, has an easier time sort of saying stuff that appeals to people's sense of, oh, this person isn't like the others. Yeah, I'll happily vote for them. And hence the fact those early 2016 debates were swept up by him because, and of course, when you're next to like Ted Cruz and what's he called, like Ben Carson and Chris Christie and all the other sort of
Ben Carson put you to sleep.
Exactly, right? Like he has the. I don't mean charisma in the sense of I'm wooed by him. I mean in the sense literally he is able to speak in a way that is captivating, and you, even if you don't agree, there's something to listen to more than just the generic sound bites that like Fox News were sort of churning through year after year. However, I think what's important to distinguish it for me is the playing on existing frameworks that do still exist with MAGA and Trump. So a large part of what's gone on has been the appeal to America's past, make America great again, right? And a large part of that has to come through looking at America's past and looking at the uncertainty and discomfort that was had when Obama was president. The idea that a black man as president is a change, literally, from America's rather troubled past. The changing social values, the changing demographics of the country, that is what a lot of MAGA has lent on. And that isn't to say that it's the only argument. As you said, right, there's just tons of stuff that's gone on. But a large part of the motivation for it in a lot of cases, certainly in parts of the country that, like are really, the sort of, I don't want to say like not cities as such, because I know cities in America are a little bit different to the UK, right? Like where a city could be like New York size or a few thousand people somewhere. But, like those, you see those neighborhoods where there's MAGA stuff everywhere, right? Trump flags, American flags with sort of Trump amendments to it.
There's a few behind me down the street.
Exactly, right? Like for as much, the UK's we've got our own share of nonsense and stuff.
Oh, sure.
We don't have that.
To be fair, you guys started it with Brexit.
Yeah, well, exactly right.
It's really your fault.
But like the way American nationalism is so much more fervent, and so a lot of MAGA is born of that nationalist isotope, right? Like a lot of the stuff that is now just part of the lexicon, part of the sort of day-to-day of American politics, was stuff built on existing undercurrents that have been brought to the mainstream by lots of actors within the MAGA movement and obviously Trump himself.
So, and I'm one who thinks that politics, statesmanship, say, is this very difficult and precarious balance always between trying to understand how do we connect these higher ideas of things, the people we want to be, with slogans and phrases and movements that make sense to the average Joe. And it's not that the average person is unintelligent, it's just that they're way too busy to be reading about these higher ideas all the time. So they need something simple to digest, to grab a hold of, and that moves them, right? Make America great again, which you're right, Donald Trump, that's MAGA, that's what it's known for. That phrase actually was used under Ronald Reagan previously in the 1980s. Now, there are a lot of individuals, and presumably you could be one of them, who see a direct line from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. I happen to be one who sees Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump as an aberration of that, as a splintering. But Reagan's movement himself said, make America great again. Now, in all fairness, he didn't lean on that terribly heavily. It was just one of many. It was more morning in America again. It was kind of this notion of we're getting out of the 1970s economic malaise. We're going to reassert ourselves, both our independence and our prosperity, and proudly behave as Americans. This is, and I can't speak to what it is like in the United Kingdom, although I imagine there is a part of this. The United States almost famously has historically a near rabid sort of "we are America, rah, rah, rah," right? It's probably a little annoying to the rest of the world, but it's something that I honestly think is potentially beautiful about the United States. There is such a high degree of patriotic fervor. It's not just conducive to MAGA America. We see this in all kinds of political movements throughout the last 200 years or more in the United States. And that is something that if a leader or a movement can find a way to tap into, it pings at the heart of your average American. Kamala Harris tried this on the left when she ran for president, in that there was very much we're proud to be Americans, even though what they meant by it was slightly different than, say, what Donald Trump meant by it. I think some of that can be goofy and dangerous. I also think some of it can be necessary in order to firmly establish, well, what is it we're trying to do here as a people? It's not a cerebral argument that caused Americans to storm Normandy Beach in World War II, or for the British people to defiantly stand up against Hitler as their cities are being bombed. It had to be something a little bit more of, no, this is ours. This place is special. I love this place I call home, and I'm going to defend it. It's something that you feel in your bones almost. Obviously, all of our nations can go awry and do very awful, terrible things. So you got to be a little bit In my own view, I think a mature way to look at it is you look at your country the same way you do your parents, presuming you have had decent parents, and not all of us do, I understand. But when you're a child, your parents are godlike and they do no wrong. And then when you're a teen, they don't do anything right, right? But then as you get older, you start to realize, well, wait a minute. They had challenges. They've done some good things. They've done some wrong things. I can acknowledge these wrong things they've done while still have a lot of admiration and respect for them. And I think that's necessary in any nation state for a nation to be cohesive, to truly love your country. Does not mean you forgive it for the wrongs it's done. It doesn't mean you can't correct it and hope it does better. But it does mean that you recognize this place is mine and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful for the good things it stood for. And that from that, you can build a more lasting, just future.
Right. And I think there's a lot of that, which there's parts of that which I can see myself agreeing with, right? But I think this is where, for me, the important intervention has to come in, because we can love our communities and be proud of where we live and proud of who we are and proud of bonds we have in our communities. But America's history, as having that, has taken other parts of itself, to bad places in the sort of mass, through the language of what you've just said there, has done terrible things draped in the American colors. And this is true of any nation, right? Like, I'm from Britain. Britain has exactly the same colonial horrible history, right? And I think MAGA, as it argues in much of the way you've just done there, right, for making America go back to its roots of everyone being great in America, being proud of who we are and where we are and stuff. But rather than having values that might be of consideration for being proud of and might be making places worth living, they use that instead to highlight the the sort of attacks on things they dislike, attacks on elements of the country's past which conflicts with many of the values of the the far right and stuff, which are sort of at the heart of much of the MAGA movement. And so when I say things like white supremacy and such, and fascism and patriarchal ideas, this is a lot of the core of the MAGA style stuff, which I think is coming to the forefront of it. Because you can imagine that in 2016, there's a person who has been largely uninterested in politics, right? They can't stand turning on the news and seeing whatever political figure is on the news that day. And then Trump comes on and he's different and he doesn't speak like the others. And they start wanting to watch and stuff. But as that's happening, people within those movements who are openly far right and know what they want to have out of the country radicalize people who come into it and drag them further and further right with nice sounding things which have stuff hidden within it, right? So the idea that America could be great if we got rid of the corrupt and bad people. Well, corrupt is an adjective which could apply to a lot of things, and it's been used fairly disingenuously to sort of be aimed at enemies of the state, i.e. people they've decided aren't American that day. If we look at the long history of the American nationalism and American pride being used to attack people of different identities and belief systems and stuff, it's quite an ugly one, right? And I think the irritating thing for me with MAGA especially is that all the things that would make a place great are things that can be done within and outside the current political system. But we need to be able to also identify and criticize when it's just fervent far right nationalism, trying co-opting things and using it to see what we're having now, right? Where you've got a terrible political landscape, you've got bigotry as policy almost, you've got all sorts of horrible things going on, and the MAGA crowd are still sort of saying, we've got to make America great, we've got to keep going. Like, there's been no reflection on the fact that it's been dragged so far right. And I think part of that's intentional because, a lot of the people there do genuinely want it. But the people who have entered MAGA and sort of been wrapped up into the furore, they've been radicalized, and there's not, it's almost like it's not spoken about enough by in a lot of places in my mind.
So, and it's good, by the way, we're past 20 minutes into the conversation, and so far we've been in violent agreement way too much. We're probably boring the listeners to death. So I appreciate you bringing this up because, and I do, this is probably where it'd be more beneficial for you if I was in fact very pro-MAGA, because I could take a stronger stance against what you just said. Instead, I'm going to give a gentle rebuke, I'll call it.
Okay.
I think that much of what you're saying is correct. However, it's also disproportionate. It's not conducive to what I'm seeing. When I talk MAGA, the people I have met individuals who are true bigots, who are true racists, who are true radicals, who do in fact believe that one makes America great again by eradicating those who don't adhere to, say, a cisgender, white, patriarch, Christian, normal society, if you will. But I think it is severely overblown, the degree to which that actually explains this phenomenon. And it's not that I'm unconcerned about that. I'm far more concerned about my relatives, who I love dearly, who I know are not those things, that are involved in a political movement that sees collective action rather than individual responsibility, rather than that is far more interested in defeating, say, and this is something we could talk about, wokeism on a college campus in a place they've never been, than they are in understanding how to actually be a good and decent person in my own life. Like, maybe where I'm at right here in my own local community, I could do more good. And that they get too swept up in kind of the rhetoric of sort of presuming the country. Because everything you just said, there is a version of that on the right that says the exact same thing, right? The left is radicalized. The left wants to turn us all into hyper-socialists that hate the very fiber of what it means to be in this country. And I don't want to dispute that those people exist. I just think the vast majority of arguments actually don't take place between those two hyper-radicalized groups, even though they do exist. I think most Americans, this isn't true of all countries at all times, most Americans are neither of those two things. Most Americans who, say, celebrate Trump's, let's say, immigration policies, don't necessarily themselves hold bigoted views because they don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of the policies themselves. They may simply think, look, the nation needs fewer illegal immigrants. Honestly, that's a proposition I agree with. I just don't happen to agree with the way the Trump administration is going about it. But I think there's a lot more there than simply a notion of, I don't like people who are not like me, let's keep them out of the country. I think there's more a notion of, look, there's a lot of good people who are not like me in the country legally. Why don't we limit illegal immigration and prioritize those who do want to come here? And it gets mixed in with this very complicated web of, yes, there's also bigotry involved. Yes, there's also, I wouldn't even call it bigotry. I would just call it a cultural unawareness of the other, right? I live in a predominantly white community. I don't know that much about Hispanic Americans. They're the other, if you will. It's not that I do or don't like them. I just don't think much about it.
Yeah.
And so
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off then.
Oh, you're fine.
So I think that's probably then where we have a sort of slight, not even a break really, but like a disagreement of sorts. Because I think whilst it isn't, I think the dichotomy of like bigot and non-bigot is a little bit of a false one. Like, we all have ideas and thoughts which are influenced by social prejudices and hierarchies and such from today and historically, right? Like, so we, rather than sort of framing it as like you said, true racism earlier, like, of course there are people who are like KKK, right, obviously just hate black people for through their entire existence, but someone can recognize that person is racist and not believe they are a racist, if you ask them, but also still hold racially, prejudiced views, right? Because the influence that makes you say, I'm fine with someone coming to the country legally, but illegal immigrants, deserve to be deported, still has an undercurrent of sorts, which, if we were to scrutinize the terms there, has an element of prejudice of sorts. Because, like, let's say we speak to one of these MAGA people and they're like, well, I'm fine with people coming here legally, but we've got to tighten the border. The border they are almost certainly referring to is the southern border of America, America to Mexico. Mm-hmm. There's far less attention and scrutiny paid to Canada and America. And I'm sure if you asked them, they'd say, yeah, if you come from Canada illegally, I want them gone as well. But in action, in what they actually mean, we know their focus is almost certainly on the immigration that takes place of non-white, potentially foreign language speaking people coming into America. And I think that is why it's important for me to scrutinize MAGA and the sort of movement and such, and to not be afraid to say, well, actually, yeah, there is a bit of a problem with how a lot of it has conducted itself, because those, like, if we're going to improve, improve things and be in a better, healthier place, part of that is reflecting on what has gone before and saying, well, actually, there's things which we do need to challenge. Like bigotry isn't just the KKK or someone with, like a white supremacist group, right? Which I think it's also important to stress is a fairly vocal part of MAGA as well, right? I mean, there's quite a lot of far right stuff there, but the average American who's just supporting Trump but doesn't really know what's going on beyond hearing it on social media and isn't like actively participating in like white supremacy marches, but is still willing to say, yeah, I don't want to be illegal immigrants here. They're still being influenced by those bigoted ideas, and even if it's not the same degree of bigotry, it also contributes to the same, like the person who's at the other end of the ice raid getting like dragged out of their workplace and sent off to prison or detention center without any due process. Like that, it doesn't matter that some people who voted Trump weren't as bigoted as the racists, open KKK members voting Trump. Like there's still negative actions for everyone in society. So I think that to sort of try and condense that,
Sure.
Of course, there's degrees of bigotry, but it all is still negative and harmful, and it all still needs to be scrutinized.
I think that I think I understand what you're saying. However, it sounds like there may be two separate things going on here. One is it is true an individual doesn't have to be a raging racist, right, to intentionally or even say unintentionally support policies or politicians that may themselves behave in bigoted ways, or in ways that say, even if they're not bigoted, like maybe maybe there's no ill intent. Let's just put it that way. Maybe no one has any ill intent, and yet the reality is the policies are in fact harmful to certain minority groups. But I think the other thing going on, and maybe what I was more alluding to, is very often the retort to any effort at trying to have a serious conversation of, well, what should be done about immigration policy is almost immediately met with sort of these tinges of, well, we can't talk about it because it's bigotry to suggest that, we have anything other than open borders. In other words, is it conceivable that there is a problem beyond just people being bigoted that they're hinting at when they say immigration is a problem? Is it conceivable it has nothing to do with, or to put it a different way, maybe if these individuals themselves are bigoted to varying degrees, maybe there's an additional problem here. Maybe it's economic. Maybe it's a concern about cultural loss. Maybe it's crime increases in certain locations. And I would even go so far as to say, although one has to be careful here, individuals, I think, in a free society need to feel strongly in their bones that they do, in fact, have some sovereignty over the places that are theirs. And so even if we knew with absolute certainty that we're not increasing the crime rate, say, by allowing additional illegal immigrants to populate a certain community, these individuals themselves don't increase the crime at all, I think it is important for people to feel that they have some ownership in their society, that they perceive that crime is something that they are responsible for controlling, for being, not that it's that we don't give people an excuse to think it's actually the outsider causing these things. It occurs to me I'm kind of getting off track, but I guess that's what I'm saying. I think there's two separate things here. One is, yes, bigotry is a problem, and you can support policies that could have bigoted outcomes, even if you're not a bigot yourself. But that doesn't mean the policies themselves only have bigoted explanations. It could be that there are more going on, and I think it's incumbent upon us to try to untangle that. In fact, let me just put the question to you, and I know this is your show, so feel free to not answer since you're the one asking me. But I mean, it's not escaped my attention there in Europe and the United Kingdom. Immigration is a hot topic also. Is there I'll put it this way. Is there a left of center response to how we deal with, say, the excesses of immigration that is still fair and just to minorities and it is not bigoted, say?
Okay. So I can try and answer that question at the same time as respond to what you said, because I think there's a similar sort of answer. And so I think people who are concerned about immigration absolutely come in different sort of stripes. Like you've got the sort of KKK style, like, yeah, get them out stuff. But you're right. There's people who have troubles in their lives which they can identify either viscerally through things like prices rising or just jobs not being around, and then sort of abstractly. So, you don't necessarily touch or feel the economy directly and sort of the culture directly, but they're things you sort of understand through the existence of society, right? Like you're in society, and so you can think about it as a person that's beyond just like, touching things physically to know it's there. And I think immigration is one of those things which I think, going back to the sort of critique of general societal trends, because we always speak about immigration in fairly similar terms, like all the immigrants are, what problems do they cause, or what do they gain, how many are coming into the country, we lose track a little bit of some of the wider concepts and how it's discussed. So it's good. Immigration in our country, for instance, has increased in part because we've had we lost access to the EU, so we got to get the workers from somewhere, right? So it's a little bit ironic that many of the
and I'm sorry, just for an ignorant American such as myself, when you say immigration, what kind of people groups are we talking about? Like, who is the predominant UK immigrant?
Well, it was like people from the EU before, but now you're seeing lots of people from Southeast Asia. You're seeing people from the Commonwealth countries. Lots of nationals from beyond the European, Western Europe and such. Because we had massive gaps in our care system, the NHS, and in domestic labour. So we needed, obviously, the country's not going to run if there's not loads of people, filling those gaps. So, they had to, the government had to put initiatives in to get lots of different people in. And I think that is one of the other things which is really important. Like, immigrants are people who are going somewhere because of pull factors and push factors. So the push factors might be their country has a lower quality of living, might be some disaster that's happened. The pull factors are, there's more quality of life is higher in Western nations like the UK and the US. You've got more rights as a person living there. You might not have citizenship, so you don't get all the rights, which is, we can discuss whether that should be the case in that later, potentially. But certainly as a person just existing in the country, you aren't likely to be attacked and shot and stuff, which obviously isn't the norm in lots of countries, but the quality of life is higher here. So that person isn't I feel like a lot of the time it's like you get this nefarious, immigrants are this bad entity sort of coming, which then is the framework that is used in a lot of the discussions around it. So before a person's even actually had the chance to think about why immigrants are doing certain things, they've gone in via a very right-wing source, like a proper, especially with social media now, you get all these reactionary sort of inflammatory tweets and social media posts where it's like, oh, the immigrants are coming and there's 1 million coming to your city right now. And it's like, already, if that person has only heard about that in sort of, process of thinking about it, of course they're going to have a negative slant. Of course, they're going to center the issues in their life around something like that. And I think to come back to, sorry to speak for ages, by the way, to come back to what you said sort of earlier in what you were saying, and to try and sort of answer your question as well, we don't speak about anywhere near to the same amount, cuts to public services, the lack of, so like if you, in the UK, we've had cuts for the last 15 years to our schools, our hospitals, our transportation, like where I live in Devon, the buses are not fantastic. At all. And so if you don't drive a car, which lots of people don't, you've got a really tough time getting around it. You're having to orchestrate your routine and stuff around buses, which don't run very reliably because the money's not put into the services and stuff. And that's the same thing with culture, right? Like culture, as well as being something you sort of just feel, it is sustained through things in society, right? I'm a massive sports fan. I love sports. You would call it soccer, I'd call it football. I'm a massive fan of that. But for it to be part of it's easier with football because obviously, all you need is like two things to be a goal and then a ball, right? But if you haven't got spaces to play that are somewhat maintained, then it's hard to get into it. It's the same with any sport, right? You need things for it to be of culture. You need it to be there in society. And so when you don't have the funding for those things, when those things aren't looked after, it can make people think, oh, why is this not the case? Why they're going to feel like unhappy if things aren't around in society. And rather than speak about, why resources aren't being used democratically, why we don't have the access to things, why we're spending so much time working and not enjoying life, we are railroaded to talk about problems which are, there's an agenda that, I don't like your word agenda because it sort of is used so often in society, but people want you speaking about immigrants because it plays on existing societal bigotries. I mean, someone in the chat says this: when you think if every brown person is potentially illegal, that's inherently bigoted. And I think that's a really good point, because the immigrant conversation always comes back to, essentially the other, like you said earlier, being in a place they shouldn't be. Or in other words, the legacy of white supremacy, sort of saying people who are not white and like us have no place in our society. And that is the undercurrent that's been played on a little bit, which is why, to come back to what we were saying about immigration, the solution is almost to think more critically than just seeing immigrants as some bad entity, and instead thinking, well, why are people coming to the country, and are they the real issue, or is it something elsewhere? And you can speak now, because I was just thinking for quite a few minutes.
That's quite all right. And some of this may be a bit difficult because of the peculiarities between our nation's histories, although I think there's a lot of similarities here. Speaking as someone who comes from the right, say in the United States, the broader right, here in the United States, I've been a member of the Republican Party my entire life. A lot of what we're seeing in MAGA America, or Trump America, is a strong response to the failures, say, of previous generations of Republicans, specifically the George W. Bush approach, which was never particularly successful with immigration, but had long touted and wanted a more comprehensive policy solution. In other words, it's kind of this notion of, we want more immigrants, but we want fewer illegal immigrants, right? We want to make it easier for people to get in the country. We're going to consider things like amnesty. We're going to consider things like fast-tracking processes. And a lot of these, say, more populist elements, and I wasn't entirely unsympathetic to these views, said, no, the first thing we need is secured borders. And then once we do that, then we can have a conversation about this. And in that group, there were two different, broadly speaking, subgroups. One were the bigots, and then the others were those who said, look, the past 40 years, we have been talking about securing the border and never actually done it. And in the meanwhile, we have granted amnesty. We have lowered restrictions, and we have no control over the immigration policy. This is something the conservative podcaster Jonah Goldberg is often asked. When someone asks him the question, what immigration policy do you prefer? His response is to have one. In other words, it's not that I want no immigrants, much immigrants. It's just there's no policy currently. It's sort of it's a broken system that we can all agree is broken, but we can't seem to come up with any sort of, okay, well, how do we secure the border and simultaneously allow more immigrants in? And for this reason, this went on for so many years until you eventually get a Donald Trump, someone who speaks in, I'll call it potential dog whistling, say racist light terminology, stuff that maybe it's not in and of itself racist, but it's certainly not something you would say ordinarily in good company to the public, and would sound terribly welcoming of people. But most people gravitated toward it, which is something that's, I think people need to countenance this fact. Donald Trump, when he ran for president the second time, won more votes with Hispanics. He won more votes with black men here in the United States. I don't want to discount, I don't mean by that everything he's saying is okay. I mean by that a lot of individuals who are themselves minorities said, this guy's not a bigot, he's just actually different. He's speaking against the system that has promised for 40 years, we're going to solve your immigration problem, and never have. And I think that's needful to talk about, because I think what happened here was a near 40 years of the American people losing faith in those who claimed that they wanted secure borders, but they also wanted a free and fair immigration system that allowed a maximum amount of immigrants in. I think it's difficult to do that. Let's just acknowledge, a fair immigration system is hard, is complicated, say, and it requires a lot of infrastructure, it requires a lot of onboarding, say, a lot of identifying, okay, who's coming in here, where, how do we house them, how do we feed them, how do we care for them, how do we integrate them, how do we assimilate them, if we will, into American culture. The United States has been, I think this is probably a fair statement, I think it's fair to say the U.S. is the most successful nation ever at assimilating foreign people into an American ethos, broadly speaking, right? In other words, unlike, say, France or Germany, the UK is not too bad at this, but a lot of other nations, um, you can live in France your entire life, you'll never be French if you're not born there. Whereas in America, you can be from elsewhere, and you can adopt these ethos and these commonalities. And our nation has historically been really, really good at that. Really good at allowing people to see that they come from somewhere else, but that they identify themselves as Americans. And so I think there's a degree to which America, and I'm speaking for myself here, that we're proud of that heritage. We do not want in any way to shut off the siphon for, say, immigrants, but that there is a necessary distrust of the way the government has treated this for the last 40 years. That leads to individuals like Donald Trump, who I think have a terrible immigration policy approach, but they make him popular because they're like, well, if they haven't actually solved the problem, we'll give this guy power to sort of, let's say, give the middle finger to the immigrant, to let them know they're not welcome here, to let them know that certainly the illegal immigrant is someone we consider dangerous and the other, and someone who we don't want. And I want a world that's different. I want a world that, in America, I'll say, I want an America that respects our borders while simultaneously welcomes immigrants as individuals who add value to our culture. But it has to be processed and ordered and controlled. And I think in absence of that, you end up with sort of a MAGA America response. So, well, it's not going to be ordered and controlled. We just don't want it at all.
Okay. I mean, there's parts of that I do agree with. I think that, I think France and Germany and the UK are probably also fairly diverse as well. And definitely.
That's fair. That's fair. I just meant Western Europe has done a good job of it as well.
Exactly right, because our nations are so big and diverse. They absolutely do have that element of if you come here, anyone's welcome, right? Like anyone can come and be British, French, American. But I would say that a lot of that is in spite of the nationalist fervency we see, because there's an element of it which is, yes, if you can imagine there's some sort of distilled version of this nationalism that is, we are proud of our nation, and if you want to come here, brilliant, you're part of a nation as well if you're proud of it. But that isn't so much what we see, it carried out in practice, because inevitably these nationalist movements, as was sort of said in the chat earlier, they are exclusive for who can be part of this nationality. So in the UK, the fuss, we are, as you said, right, we've got the immigration debate always going on, and there's always this discussion of it's changing British identity and such. Well, British identity has been of many, many different cultures. And I mean, our nation has been invaded over the last 1,000 years. How many times? We've had the Romans here, the Normans, the Vikings. There's always, throughout our history, we've always had different cultures coming. But it's only when, the sort of non-white global populations start showing up that suddenly immigration is now, hotbed topic. We can't have them here anymore. In America,
but I'm sorry, but is that true? I mean, let's say in the Normandy invasion, were people on the British Isle just totally cool with it, or they're saying this is terrible?
No, they weren't happy, there. But for one, there wasn't a Britain as sorts, and my point is more that no one said of previous invasions now that it is some British culture has been lost, right? And no one cares when Europeans sort of move nation to nation and such. It's when people who look different and who don't fit with a visual image of what Britain should be start coming that it suddenly becomes an issue. It's also why the focus is so heavily on the global South coming to the West, and never other immigrants in different Western nations coming. And part of that is the inbuilt racism that's in a lot of these movements. To try and focus on I'm trying to think what else you said then. Voters who are Black or Hispanic and stuff voting for Trump, I think is interesting. So I think it's critical of any election to say that for as much as we focus on those who did vote, it's really important to focus on those who didn't vote. More Americans didn't vote than did in that election. And in most elections in Britain, the turnout is never as high as it should be, and is never therefore truly representative of what people want, which is telling, because people, I think it's not unfair to say people are very fed up with the general direction of politics and mainstream politics in general, hence, like we were saying earlier, right? So whilst of course people did vote for Trump more, it's not truly like a compelling, like, MAGA has captured the hearts of the nation as such. It's a lot of people in certain areas voted more for him than did in previous elections, which I don't think then we can extrapolate sort of just the narrative that we had a second ago of immigration as sort of like people being fed up with 40 years of no policy. I wouldn't quite agree with, because firstly, there definitely was still immigration framework in place. I agree it was terrible and bad and not very well thought out, but it's not as though, I mean, the idea that the Democrats and Republicans said, yeah, let's just have a free-for-all, guys, let's just come in if you want. Like, of course, no, they were still very strict. ICE was around for a decade before Trump has really sort of started, ramming it up. It was still wrong then, and I think I don't personally agree at all with the sort of premise behind it, but it's not a new thing. What we're sort of saying is that the far right within MAGA and such have taken existing bigotries and pushed them to whole new extremes. And I think with immigration, the framework of the debate as we need to control it, we need to think about it more sensibly, to me ignores the wider point, which is that, for one, nationality isn't to me something which defines like culture and community, because like living in cities, you're surrounded by people of all sorts of nationality, and other than sort of acknowledging that a person is, that person is from France or from South Africa or wherever, you find yourself sort of just getting on with your life because you have to. It's in lots of pockets where people are more isolated and more exposed to only the MAGA type coverage of immigration and such, that we see more of the sort of, the immigrants are running wild, it's just got out of control, we've got to rein things in a little bit. And I think that speaks to the fact that, for as much as obviously people are still like Trump supporters in cities, but part of the reason MAGA has a bit more success, certainly in terms of volume and stuff, because like cities obviously have MAGA, but it's less, more people aren't MAGA. Sorry, I'm phrasing this badly. MAGA is more commonly found outside urban areas than in urban areas, because part of the driving factor of it is that sort of prejudice, which is harder to accrue in a city when you're surrounded by people of different types of, different nationalities and such. In more rural areas and in areas where there's less diversity, as we sort of said earlier, it's easier to portray an other as the whole problem of America, and also then to have the other as like responsible for things like crime and lack of jobs, which, if we were to think about it, are more to do with economic reasons and general national organization than one person potentially coming from Mexico to America, not through legal channels.
Yeah, so I think that's true to an extent. I think yet again we're in mild agreement with some annoying kind of nuances around the edges. Let me put it this way. I think that while it can be true that there are individuals, say, in more rural areas in the United States who hold more bigoted views because it's easier, because they don't know these people, right? They just see them on Fox News of, those are the crime-ridden, disease-ridden individuals who come in here swarming from the outside and they're destroying our culture. You can also have the reverse of that. It can also be a lot easier to think well of immigrants when you don't ever have to deal with an immigrant, right? When your community is all one thing and it's just some theory out there, they're the other. You may not think poorly of them. You might think just fine of them. I myself, not at the moment, but lived in a neighborhood where we had immigrants from Latin America on the east side of my house and the south side. And one of them was an incredibly lovely family, and the others were just awful people. And so far as I could tell, nationally, as far as their ethnicity went, they're identical. It was just their behaviors were very different. But I want to return to, just for clarity's sake, because you bring up an important point about when Donald Trump, he won more Hispanic votes and he won more black men. I mean, it is true. Hispanic's a little different because that's getting closer to like a 50-50 mix here in the U.S. But it's not that Black America suddenly became Republican. I mean, that would be ridiculous. They vote for Obama in 85 to 90% ranges or something like that.
Consistently high for Democrats.
Very high, but they have always been very high for Democrats. Well, I shouldn't say always. Ever since the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, it's moved more and more that direction. Certainly in our lifetimes, they've always voted more for Democrats. The point is not that, as Donald Trump, because he's an egotistical maniac, wants us all to believe I've cracked the code. I have forever solved this. Now Republicans are going to be able to enjoy minority votes because everybody loves me. It's more that in that 40-year spread I was talking about, the original strategy in the Republican Party was to look into the future and say, the United States of America is becoming a near, or we'll call it a minority majority country. It's not that exactly, but the proportion of voters who are predominantly white and traditional of European descent is becoming more and more and more, or is becoming smaller, right? And we're getting more Hispanics, Black Americans, other nationalities are increasing. And they just began to look at the percentages of who would win presidential elections. And when George W. Bush won, I can't remember what the percentage was, but he won the largest percentage of Hispanics in both of his two races. And what was scaring the Republican Party at the time was that under Mitt Romney and John McCain both, if they had won those exact same percentages George W. Bush did, they would have lost those races. I mean, they did anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But the point here is that because the Hispanic population was increasing so rapidly, you could keep that same ratio and you were going to lose. So the Republican Party thought, we got to do something about this. Well, at the time, what they thought we got to do is we got to be more Mexican friendly. We've got to show Hispanic Americans that we're not as strong on border security. We're not as strong on ICE, things of this nature. And this, again, is, I don't want to just repeat myself, but this is what started that whole fight for the last 40 years, say, on the right, because the populist base says we want nothing to do with this. We are concerned about immigration. And it wasn't until Donald Trump comes along that it turns out demography is not necessarily destiny. Most of those Hispanic Americans have immigrated, and they don't just vote with the Democratic Party. Some of them are voting Republican. So those ratios have went up, right? The percentage of, say, Hispanic Americans as compared to the rest of the United States is increasing, but the percentage of them that are voting Democrat has leveled off. And I guess what I'm saying here is that it's although it occurred to me I may have lost my train of thought. I apologize. That I'm with you in that it's not a matter of Donald Trump is solving the bigotry problem. It's more a matter of, I think we're seeing Hispanics immigrate and think of themselves not as Hispanics but as Americans, and maybe not even as Hispanic Americans but as Americans first. And that ultimately, and this is something we saw with the Italians, something we saw with the Irish, like there are a generation or two where they're the other. And then eventually, I heard that Christopher Columbus was made a big deal in the United States as an effort to try to normalize Italian Americans so that the standard WASP Americans could look at Italians and think, oh, okay, well, maybe they're kind of like us. Well, nowadays it's bizarre to think, if there's an Italian, I don't refer to people as an Italian American. They're a white guy, right? It's, and I think these things throughout generations do ultimately change. I do think it's slow and painful and ugly, but I do think there is going to be a day when the Hispanic American is not necessarily going to be thought of as brown or the other. And so I think now blacks may be a different subject just because the history of them coming to the United States was different. But as far as those who choose to immigrate here, I think through process of time, they do ultimately consider themselves to be American.
Well, exactly right. I think there's always, there's loads of interesting things to dissect there, right? So I think it's really interesting that we brought up the Italian American, Hispanic American sort of thing, right? Because Italians and immigrants coming to America in like the sort of early 20th century were frowned upon. Mm-hmm. There's lots of discrimination and such. And then we see as a civil rights movement starts, and we've got black people trying to get better, fair representation and such as part of a wide fight against white supremacy in America. All of a sudden, Italians are now part of white America, right? Like whiteness isn't like people. You hear white and you think skin color, and obviously it's referring to pigmentation, but it's ideology as well, because it's thinking about how society has organized itself along racial divisions. So the reason you're quite right? Hispanic American may one day be just seen as one of the many, German American, Dutch American, like one of them.
Right.
But it depends on who's saying it, because we're lumping a lot of people, because Hispanic is being used here to refer to like Mexican, Venezuelan, Colombian, there's like dozens of
right
nationalities. Which, and I think as well, it's also important to stress that as well as nationality divides, as Raptor points out quite rightly, there's also a gender divide, because it's not as though it's only sort of like everyone from Hispanic nations is voting in more likely one way. And on top of all of that, whilst of course I think it is important to identify division, so they're all socially constructive, these things, but they are things which exist in society, right? Like the pigmentation difference between myself and yourself is just pigmentation. It's just a pigment in the skin. But obviously someone, is able to see that I am black and you are white based on the social reality that we're in. And so whilst I wouldn't, everyone is their own individual. Like, it's not as though a black person thinks, yes, I am black, time to vote Democrat. It's reacting to the history of America since, as you said, the civil rights movement, which says, yes, this party is the party which has, more racial conscious than the party with like white supremacists running around in it. So I think there is a lot of interesting stuff to think about there. I'm trying to recall what was said at one point in that little, little bit you were saying.
Yeah, sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there.
No, it's not at all. I did a little bit of that as well. There was something you said which I wanted to come back to. I think it was immigration related. I think that was it. Okay, so the idea that immigration is the issue as such, I think, is one which, like, if you're going into the sort of the conversation with that as like the thing to be scrutinized, it loses a lot of the human element, for one, because America, a nation like America, like, has in my mind no real business sort of saying, well, immigration is this bad thing, because the look at the history of it, right? Like, you mentioned Christopher Columbus yourself, who obviously didn't actually land in America, but like the idea that there's like people, like, to say someone is illegal is fine, following existing rules now, but if we were to scrutinize it, is it really conducive to a healthy society to sort of put things down and say, well, no, these people can come and these people can't? You have to follow these certain channels. Like, the whole framework I find problematic of sorts, because it to me divides people in a way which isn't necessary almost. Because, like, ultimately, the person coming to America from the legal channel and a person coming from the illegal channel are largely the same. They both want to improve their life, and they're just doing so. One is doing so with the consent of the US government, not the people, the government. The other is having to, take an extra legal route. And I think with illegal immigration as well, the driving factor of a lot of it is economic. Corporations in Southern American states have massively benefited from illegal immigrants, because they don't have to do many of the same regulatory practices they do with citizens of America, but still get the same labor out of them. Hence the abundance of Americans without citizenship across America. And for as much as people say, oh yes, immigration is a problem, they've absolutely benefited from said illegal immigrants coming in, because they're on farms doing loads of stuff. They're part of communities. They've been there for decades, many of them, just, without maybe the right paperwork. And I think for it to be, I mean, you're quite right in saying Trump's approach to it is disastrous, because it's not thinking about it much. But even the approach that says, yeah, we've got to cut down on illegal immigrants, you've got to come in a proper way. If that approach isn't that approach inevitably is tailored with the idea that people need to be managed and taken out of the country if they've done something wrong. Whereas we should be making it if you want to come to countries to, come and do stuff, it shouldn't be something that is restricted and monitored to the same fervent extent that we see. I wanted to, obviously you can reply to that in a second, but we've got a question or two in the chat, which I think was really interesting. And I did want to, I know that we've got sort of time limits, so I did want to also touch on woke at some point as well.
Oh yeah. We got to solve wokeism.
If you respond to just what I said just then, and I've got a question from the chat for you in a second.
Yeah. Well, I guess, look, I take your point that there is a sort of seeming arbitrariness to saying the fact that I, as an American citizen and part of the United States of America, now get to decide what is or isn't the rules seems a little arbitrary when you can go back in time. There was a point at which there were no white American citizens in North America. They were all, Native Americans, if you will. I don't think that. I think that is one of those things that has truth in it, but that you can take that way too far, because in effect that disavows all systems of government and all rules at all points. All governments started at some point. And I'm not saying that we can't have interesting and perhaps productive and good conversations about trying to understand what their origin points were. But I think we're born into the world where, we're dealing with the government we have right now. We don't get to wipe the slate clean as if none of the history came before us. And look, I also will grant that, let's just do as a thought experiment, we have two different individuals that have migrated to the United States, one legal, one illegal. The one who was legal went through all the proper channels and checked all the correct boxes and became a citizen. And it turns out they're just an awful person, right? They don't do much work. Maybe they commit crimes. And the one who's here illegally, across the Rio Grande, snuck in, and he has been a hardworking citizen, and he loves the United States, and he's contributing to society. I don't believe that just because a person's here illegally, that puts some sort of a black mark on them that makes them a bad person, or that they're incapable of contributing good things to the country. Or conversely, that just because they're here legally, that means they're a good person or someone I want in the United States. And you are quite right. It is the government. It's not me. It's not the citizens. It's the government itself making these decisions. That being said, I think you have to draw a line somewhere. Otherwise, you don't have a country. And this is difficult, right? Because we have to say, well, okay, what is the process? Are there good democratic law-abiding ways in which we can adjust the process if it looks like it's not conducive to allowing individuals in who want to come here, who are a benefit to us and to themselves, who are escaping a life? It's maybe a separate situation, but those seeking asylum from, say, political dangers or warfare or something is kind of a separate issue. But trying to, let me just put it this way. I think the United States, in its absolutely shameless means of evacuating Afghanistan and putting many, many, many lives in danger, I think in that one situation there, we have a debt to pay the Afghani people who we ought to be more deferential to, say, Afghanistans who want to move here to the United States out of a sense of security and safety, because we created a situation that put them in the mess they're currently in. And so I think this is something that is a difficult and nuanced conversation that is always going to produce winners and losers, and no one's ever going to be fully happy. I just think we are so far from a mature kind of policy that it's kind of sad. But that being said, it doesn't mean that we can't take steps in that direction. And so I'll stop there because there's a lot more I could say, but I know you mentioned there was a question.
I find myself having things to want to say in response to that as well, but I will bite my tongue for a moment and come to this interesting question. I think in response to, we mentioned earlier about culture and assimilation and stuff, and I think I sort of tend to agree with the vibe of this question. Can Josh explain American culture to us? Because I think, it's like it feels intuitive, right? But culture is what is around us. I think there's an element to it. In fact, I'll let you answer first and then we'll...
Sure. Well, because the United States, unlike most Western countries, is separated by two oceans, and we've got largely, say, very friendly neighbors, say, I think most Americans, and sometimes I'm guilty of this, walk around here thinking, it's sort of like if you live in a country you don't think you have an accent, everybody else has the accent. I think we have a hard time sometimes recognizing we have our own culture. And I have been told, and I think the few times I've been outside the United States, that's when you notice it. When you go somewhere else, like, oh, okay, now I'm in someone else's culture, and I'm out here in this other culture, and I meet another American. I was in Haiti and I met someone, he wasn't American, but I met a Canadian, and there's almost this instant sort of, I reckon this guy feels familiar to me, right? Just the way our mannerisms, the way we speak and conduct ourselves. And so I think at a very base level, an American culture is, you're right. It's something you're so surrounded by. It's like a fish doesn't know it's wet. It's just unique and it's different. But I also think you can explain American culture through our history somewhat, and that we are at times foolishly optimistic people. We can do it. We're like somebody described us? We're like a group of golden retrievers, right? In some ways, it's happy-go-lucky. We can get this done. We can do it ourselves. Doesn't mean we're always happy. Don't get me wrong, but that we have a sort of, the world is our oyster. Of course, we can do it. We're Americans, and also a deep pride in what that means, as far as like the ability to shoulder the burdens of reality on ourselves rather than looking to others, even the government, to try to help us out of a scrape. If there's a natural disaster, it's not that we don't have governmental response, don't get me wrong, but there's an enormous amount of pride that if something goes wrong here in the United States, it's just commonplace for other states to send rescue workers and aid and help. And at times, there are instances in which like years can go on and there's no disasters, and you forget that other Americans care about you until something goes very terrible. And then it becomes this, oh yeah, that's what it means to be an American, that we're here, we're helping each other. We're not waiting for Uncle Sam or for the government to come in and fix this thing. We're actually here for each other. And all that being said, there's 330 million Americans. To try to boil that down to a single thing would be impossible. So that's just sort of like, say, the beginnings of what I would say is American culture, but there's a lot more complexity to that, obviously.
And that's an interesting answer, because I think there's a lot of things that I can see myself agreeing with that there. But I think the what this question I think is somewhat hinting to, and maybe I'm wrong, Raptor can say in the chat if I've interpreted wrong, but I think the point is that it's socially produced, and socially it's not something which you would have outside of the context of the social world. So like if because you're right, like when you meet someone who's not from, if I went to America, got on a plane and went to New York or something, I would be able to share my language, where I'm lucky that we both speak English, but we would find that there's things you would do naturally which I would think, wow, that's not something I even I would have to learn how to be in America. Right.
Right.
Like even if it's just looking a different way when I cross the road, even if it's
that'd be an important one.
Right. But then equally, if I spent some time in America, like if obviously I might still have my accent and I might still have some of my mannerisms that I've learned from spending 27 years in Britain, but I would also be part of the American community or wherever. America is also a big place. I mean, Bob rightfully says underneath that it's the country, right? Like it's National a big place in America. Mm-hmm. Someone in New York or LA is going to have a different experience to someone in I don't know, some like one of his little towns somewhere in like a rural Midwest state, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something which is learned, and I think for as much as we of course we want people who are in our areas to get along and be nice and stuff, it's not something which is like the American versus the other. Well, everyone at one stage was the other, and everyone can learn to get along. And I don't think as well that like difference is also part of life, right? Like it's not, sure, of course you wouldn't want someone doing really heinous activities, but if you met someone and they spoke with an accent, or they maybe ate differently to you, or they had different ways to spend their time, like ultimately they aren't barriers to being able to exist in the same space. And I think part of the reason we're critical of MAGA, as well as being obviously just a lot of horrible people, is thinking about the actual merits of people being able to move around and live in different places. And firstly, the fact that it happens because of economic reasons. Like people wouldn't come to our nations in such great numbers if it wasn't obviously more economically viable to live a life here than elsewhere. But equally, that immigration has had many benefits for both our nations, and it's just part of life. It's not like, for as much as for even if it was implemented like poorly, which is debatable, I think there's something to be said for just people have the freedom to be able to move around, and ultimately, especially in a free market society. I mean, I'll give you a spoiler. I'm not the most right-wing person. I have slightly different views on capitalism, but
Sure.
in a free market economy, if you want to come and sell your labor and sell your skills and stuff somewhere, you should be able to. So in some ways, it's interesting. I think we can sort of see the intersection of American thought with Americans' sort of history, Americans' troubled history of white supremacy and stuff interacting, because immigrants are essentially just people selling their labor in a different place. And of course, you get immigrants who absolutely fit the stereotype of lazy, awful human being that's just come there to do bad things. But that's also lots of Americans as well, and vice versa in both cases, right? Like it's as though nationality is something just socially constructed. And for as much as you can maybe learn and assume certain things, if they say, yes, I'm from Venezuela, Brazil, France, wherever, it's always more important to think of the actual person, the person behind the nationality. And so that's, I think, at the core of a lot of why MAGA stuff needs to be firmly rejected, in my opinion. But let us move on to a somewhat tangential topic. I think it does overlap quite a lot. Woke. Now, I've put woke in quotation marks. I saw a video pop up on, I'm not actually sure how, I think because I spent a bit of time keeping tabs on / watching a little bit of conservative stuff. I like to, I don't like some of it. I find just it's too much, but I try and I like the smaller channels a lot of the time. I like having a look at what, because like the bigger channels that are so driven by like advertising stuff, like they're saying stuff because they've got a billion sponsors, right? So in some ways, I find it interesting going to a channel like yours, which is maybe not got a million subscribers. I'd never say that in an insulting way. Like, I don't care about subscriber counts and stuff.
I talk about Edmund Burke a lot, and it turns out that does not get you millions of subscribers.
Exactly, right. I think one of your live streams was something like you spoke to someone and you had a discussion about woke, and they'd written a book which had an interesting title. It was something like the woke virus or something.
The woke mind, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Like, and it did make me laugh because I do find a lot of that sort of stuff a bit absurd. But I thought it's become a bit of a like a talking point, right? Like you hear somewhat I mean, we have lots of news channels in the UK, and a lot of them use that term as though it were a normal adjective, right? Like in the same way that you might say liberal or conservative, people now say woke, a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you, what you, if someone says like define what woke is, what would you try and define it as?
That's a fair question, and obviously a difficult question a good many people have had a hard time doing. By the way, let me just say that this is the perfect format to ask the question. It's free-flowing, it's conversational. We don't have strict time limits, right? Most of the time when this question is asked, it's in like a 10-second sound bite, and the person never can answer it. The individual you're referring to, Ryan, he's a well, I'll say good friend of mine. He's been on my show a couple of times. I've been on his. He, as you may have picked up in the conversation I had with him, he just recently graduated with a degree in psychology and has begun a career in that path. And a lot of what had alerted him, because he actually, I don't know if you know this or not, but he was a socialist, a very avowed socialist who worked here in the United States with the Workers' Parties, who was trying very much to bring about the democratic socialist revolution, if you will, here in the United States. Very much a Bernie bro, very much part of the Chapo Trap House crowd. He became disillusioned, not in college, but in graduate and higher education, because he genuinely wanted to help people. And he said so much of his higher degree education was about what he would define, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but I'm just saying this is where that conversation comes from, as sort of a radical woke ideology. That in effect, the most good a person could do was not to help an individual because the entire system is broken and corrupt. And so therefore, the appropriate posture is to be an activist, to be one who is working against the largely patriarchal dominated system. All that, and I just mean that as a setup. When you ask me what does woke mean, it obviously is a problematic term. It is it is a term that has evolved somewhat over recent decades, let's say, and I think loosely it combines a lot of different groups, sort of your Ibram Kendi's about racial disparages, intersectionality, notions that of critical race theory. I think what these things possibly all have in common is the general idea that the world is unjust and that it is within our power and our right and our duty to set things right. And that by unjust, they would look at power structures, who is in charge, and those power structures tend to be collectivized, right? It can be capitalism. It can be whites. It can be the patriarchy. It is some sense of a collective group that is in charge and that they are essentially oppressing or harming those who are not in charge. And so therefore the right thing to do is to work against this system so that it's just. I could go on there. There's a lot more, but maybe I should stop and see, is that hitting anywhere around where you think a definition can begin, or did you have something completely different in mind?
Yeah, no, there's there was a lot of there that I think would be fairly what would be in a sort of general socially understood idea of what woke is, right? I think you're absolutely right? It's about that awareness of unjust structures and hierarchies and stuff. What I would say, though, is that it's always important. I think it's lost on a lot of people. That woke as a term originally started in African American circles and Black circles as like for what the exact thing you just said, right? Awareness of the fact that society had a lot of unjust things in it, right? Mm-hmm. And we're talking like Black circles from times when legal protections were not in place, and from times when the system actively not even just had people that were racist in it. Racism was enshrined via Jim Crow and stuff. So that is where woke sort of started. And obviously as technology has improved and become more prevalent in society, it makes its way onto social media, younger generations, our generation. I don't know, I assume your age or anything. I don't. But people like our tech savvy, have a phone and do stuff on our phone generation are talking and stuff. And so as it gets onto places like Twitter, it's now not just in Black circles, but anyone can see it. And so it becomes, because people are using it, as you say, left wing and socially aware, and often speaking about issues like patriarchy and white supremacy and heteronormativity and things that are going to be critiquing power structures and stuff. And it becomes a pejorative, in the same way that like the Red Scare would label anyone a communist that spoke about social issues. So like you've got people who are basically just socially conscious liberals, and even some fairly conservative people being called communists because they've dared to stray from the path of American patriotism. Like that's almost the same sort of effect with the term woke, because you've got now woke just being used as like a way of, if you aren't in line with the sort of MAGA right-wing crowd, woke is sort of thrown around, and it's not even used that sophisticatedly in a lot of places. Like on British news, you get lots of people who just show up and basically they'll attach woke to anything, right? Like, the bins didn't get taken out this weekend. It's the woke council. The England football team had an away kit that so typically you've got white as the home kit, like a white England shirt, and then the sort of red that I'm wearing now would be like the away kit. And so they changed the away kit to have, it was like a black shirt and it had like purple and pink on the shoulders. And you get people saying, "Oh, it's woke, it's gone woke." Like, it's like, what are you talking about?
Because like an LGBTQ color scheme? What do you mean?
It wasn't even that. Like they liked the colors pink and purple. I don't even think it was LGBT. I think it was literally just. I mean, you know what? I mean, are you a sports fan? Are you? What's your?
I am not.
Choice?
I am not. Unfortunately, but like a typical American, even if I were a sports fan, I probably couldn't speak intelligently about British football, anyways.
But like, just like it's like a very typical, football teams and sports teams want to sell kits, so they make kits in lots of colors and patterns so that people buy the new ones. Like, it's just that. It's not like I don't know, the gays taking over or whatever they were trying to say it was. And I think that is, for me, a lot of the, because someone, like if someone came out of university or academia thinking, oh, there's quite a lot of the same sorts of socially activist type thoughts coming out of it, they're more than welcome to say that. It's the hijacking of the term that originated as like a way of being aware of very real things in society, right? That is why it is, I think, important to talk about in a way that's separate from just having it as like, oh, this is woke, especially when it's then used to almost signal to people who, like, to go back to sort of overlap conversations, the person in, say, rural Midwest American town, I don't know why I keep saying Midwest, there's rural towns everywhere, a rural town somewhere, right, that maybe isn't as bit older, maybe not quite as tech savvy. They're watching the news, and then suddenly, oh, this is woke. This is a woke, but like thing. It's not been used as in a proper context, and it's not been used sort of productively. It's been used to signal to the already sort of conditioned person to say, yeah, I can dismiss this because it's left wing and they've got an agenda. I think is where I come from it as, and I think a lot of people.
Yeah, and this is maybe the theme of our conversation, as I'm yet again going to try to strike a balance of what you're saying here. Let's use the Red Scare as an example. The Red Scare was a real thing in the United States, and I'm sure it had an echo effect there in the UK also. I think part of the problem was from the tradition or the history of the right is, okay, but could we at least acknowledge there are, in fact, Soviet spies in the United States government? Like we found, Alger Hiss was discovered. Individuals were discovered who actually did actively take nuclear secrets and start the Soviet nuclear arms race. There were also your Joseph McCarthy's who were complete screwballs who used this information to try to bolster their own political fortunes. And I think the same could maybe be said of the woke debate here too. In fact, I would encourage anybody to go listen to my podcast because I like people to listen to me. But go listen to my podcast and see how often I use the phrase woke or talk about woke or speak of it in these disparaging ways you can get when you listen to just, say, 15 minutes of Fox News. In fact, that conversation I had with Ryan, I opened by saying, I almost never talk about this stuff. It's not that I don't think it's an issue. It's not that I don't think it's concerning. It's that it's low-hanging fruit. It's what a lot of political commentators on the right reach for because it's the buzzword, as you're suggesting, that gets that person way out in rural America somewhere all upset. Oh, it's the woke people taking over. But think for a minute about what I was saying. I was having a conversation with Ryan, not about some theory, but about the fact that, and by the way, he had tried to kill himself at one point in his life. He was deeply depressed and disturbed. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yes, and was able to work through that. And that's why he was so impassioned about going into therapy. He wanted to help people. He wanted to reach other people who had a similar situation, and he saw as the primary barrier. And this is a personal story. Here are these professors that are literally hampering these efforts that I and my fellow students have to do good, because all they're concerned about is political activism, is trying to erase racial prejudice and power structures. And so that, I think, it's something that can be simultaneously true. It is true that woke is weaponized among politicians of ill intent who say this in order to just stir up emotions. It is also true that these things do exist. And I think we can hold these two beliefs in tandem. I think we can recognize there are elements of woke that is real and harmful, while there are elements of woke that, and maybe there's some elements of woke that's good. I'm not saying that, looking at a power structure and recognizing how that could be harmful to people is a bad thing. Absolutely not. I'm sure there's some ways in which woke has some good ideas, say. But I think that kind of takes our eye off the ball. We have to be able to talk about areas in which say, broadly speaking, woke ideology has and can be harmful while still holding in mind that it is used as a political weapon. Both things are true. But it doesn't mean we can't have the conversation about ways in which woke can go awry.
But why use woke though as the term? Like why? Like if you wanted to speak about the activism that's going on, right? Like the, I you have to forgive me because it's been a while since I saw the initial video that was posted. The
conversation with Ryan, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to focus too heavily on that because
sure. Really, yeah, I'm not trying to. It was a while back. You saw. I'm not trying to. I was just explaining some background as how I had that particular conversation.
Yeah. No, there's no. I'm not gonna. another time how we can go into that sort of stuff. But like, what I more mean is like, of course, I understand what on some levels some people are saying about not necessarily liking the direction of certain academic spaces, but they should, if they have that problem, which even if I don't agree with, they should be using they should be saying, I don't like critical analysis of racial divisions in America. I don't like this analysis because X, Y, Z. The fact that they've used the term woke, which they've lifted from black circles, African American circles, speaks to the same sorts. I mean, I'm not saying this is your friend, but the initial sort of co-opting of the term has its roots in similar discussions we've sort of mentioned earlier, but like the immigration discussion, where someone's concern, be it misplaced or not, about the way the nationality and culture of America is in relation to other nationalities and cultures, is co-opted by someone with an obvious white supremacist, racist agenda, and then turned into this massive, Trump basically running his mouth on any, what was it they were saying about Haitians before the election? Like, about the eating dogs.
They're eating the dogs and cats.
Yeah, it's like nonsense and stuff, right? Like, obviously, like just bigoted BS and stuff. Like, I think that is of a similar thing to what I'm sort of saying here. Like, if you want to sit and discuss the fact that, something we could happily sit and discuss, as we've done today, to sit and discuss disagreements and stuff. But the fact that a term like that is loaded into it straight away speaks to me that there's clearly more going on with why the term woke is being used and not other stuff, especially when you look at who it's used against, and it's always going to be people that either have some marginalized identity or critique existing sort of right-wing capitalistic structures and stuff, because of course people don't always like hearing that, and that's also because they are, if you live and you're used to sort of normalized things, then of course it's going to be hard hearing like certain things are problematic, certain things need to be critiqued. It's part of the reason there's a lot of success for the sort of MAGA crowd with people who, like, if you have grown up loving America and you've got the flag out, it's Independence Day, you're blaring off all the stuff, like, it could be fun, right? I mean, I quite like fun fact about myself, I love like cars and like Need for Speed, Hot Wheels, racing game, all of that, love it. F1, fantastic. And so I'm aware that cars have a lot of things wrong with them, not very good for the environment, quite better. Public transport is more efficient in many ways, and I'm aware of that, but I like the idea of do you play video games much at all? If I said like Gran Turismo and Need for Speed and stuff,
I'm familiar. Not in a while, but I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But I mean, there's some part of me which likes the idea of scrolling through like Mercedes, Lamborghini, BMW, all these nice cars, and looking at all the fanciest cars and stuff. Like, but I can separate that from my knowledge of the fact that it's not, cars can't be the only like means of existence, because we need to have other alternatives and stuff, and we got to also think about the climate crisis and climate change and stuff, right? So in the same vein, when someone says to someone who loves like America that maybe they've got a real connection to loads of stuff about America, when someone says actually America's got a lot of really questionable things in its history, like really bad things which are still connected to events today, there is a potential for some discomfort. And that discomfort is capitalized upon by bad faith actors who use terms like woke and hammer it in via how they cover certain events and things in society to make them resist that critique and then double down on a lot of the stuff and claim that, American culture is under attack from the woke people, i.e. black people, feminists, LGBTQ people, immigrants, etc. Right? Like, I think that is the danger of it, because you can absolutely have the discussion about the merits of certain political positions, and absolutely, I would never sit here and say, you've got to follow what I say right now, otherwise it's game over. But we've also got to recognize that yeah, there's a lot of stuff which is going to have to be discussed about in a way that is direct. Thinking about the ideas that are being said, and when we use a term like woke as a majority, I think especially a term that has been intentionally, a term used in black spaces, then taken and turned into like the insult of the week for like thousands of right-wing commentators and far right and stuff. Like there is inevitably going to be some, there has to be a discussion about that, because that's sort of the point that's been made.
I think if I understand your critique, I think I take it well in that it's and Owen, I'm going to be honest with you, this is something that I struggle with all the time, because you and I are on YouTube, where I'm in social media spaces. I know the kind of buzzwords I'm supposed to say that'll get me more clicks, and it's hard, right? Because it's like I have certain beliefs and views that I want to convey, but I also know that just saying them in a dry manner doesn't interest anybody. you have to use certain language. And so there are times when I use words that, in reflection later, I'm like, okay, I should probably not use that word in that way, or at least explain myself better. And that's why I started off earlier by saying, I encourage the listener to go back and listen to Saving Elephants and see how often do I even say the word woke? Or if I do, what context am I saying it in? Let me just put it this way, because the conversation I'd had with Ryan, and I understand you're saying you hadn't seen that interview in a while. I'm not trying to critique you on it, but like you, I populate a lot of right-wing, say, spaces, look online. I like to kind of poke around. Sometimes they seem a little exhausting. Sometimes they're interesting. It is extremely rare for me to find somebody like Ryan who is having conversations about this, what he describes, and I personally would agree with him, a radical left ideology that is destructive in certain higher educations in the United States, possibly throughout Western world. That happens a lot. I have a lot of people out there that I could invite on easily half a dozen people I could name probably just off the top of my head who would who could say that also. However, what would be different about them is they would be these very individual actors you're talking about that use this as sort of a buzzword. What's different about Ryan is when he encountered this, he went back and he read Foucault and he read Nietzsche and he tried to understand the Fabian School. And he tried to understand what a vulgar Marxist was and how that's different than, say, the 1960s shift in the left in the United States and in other parts of the Western world, and cultural Marxism, and names are escaping me. And then he read the right's critiques of them. Like I said, he originally was a socialist. He read Roger Scruton and his various views on how the left's excesses of these. In other words, he studied deeply. Okay, where do these ideas actually come from? I want to critique the idea by first understanding it. I don't want to impugn malice to people. I want to say, okay, what are you actually arguing so that I can fight against it? And he may have done an unfair job of that. I don't know. But that was what impressed me about him when I had him on my show, was that I can have this conversation with someone who understands that idea and does not just mean it as a political buzzword, like most politicians do when they say it, to just try to discredit people. And I think we live in a world in which that's difficult. I spend a good chunk of my show talking about what does the word conservative even mean. Most people would say Donald Trump was a conservative. Is he? Maybe. Depends on how you define it, I suppose. I'm a conservative. I feel like I'm nothing like Trump, but maybe there's some ways in which we're similar and I'm not seeing. But I think, and you might be able to enlighten me on this. I would presume that the word woke, while it is often used as a pejorative, is not only a pejorative. In other words, I would presume there are people on the left who see themselves as members of, say, Black Lives Matter, or see themselves as members fighting against the patriarchy, or perhaps as socialists, or in any other number of a group of, largely speaking, left-wing ideological groups, who would adopt that label, who would say, yes, I consider myself to be woke. I mean, and maybe that's not true. Maybe that's only a pejorative, but I guess I mean the term in a way that is intentionally like value neutral, so that I can therefore critique what I don't agree about those particular views.
Okay, so I can sort of see where you're coming from there, like in the sense of woke has social meaning that is sort of aligned with typically left, like associated beliefs, right? Like critique of capitalism, critique of various racial structures, awareness of discrimination and bigotry and stuff. I think that it's interesting that like that example he gave someone on the left who might use it not as a pejorative but as descriptor, right?
And I don't know if
So
that's true or not. I'm curious, genuinely curious.
I mean, I think now as it's become culturally this sort of it's like ironically used, right? Like, yeah, I'm woke,
Okay.
my wokest opinion and stuff. But then I would also say there are people who are on the left and would genuinely use it as a pejorative they would say, I'm on the left, but I'm not woke. And I think that is also something which should be critiqued, in my view, because it's like it's almost like you need that intersectional analysis, right? You can't say, yeah, I want economic justice, but we got to leave that anti-racism stuff at the door. And obviously they wouldn't frame it as that. Like, no one's going to say like, yes, I am anti-racist. Like, but that's in effect as to what we're doing, right? Like the idea that, I'm for the left and for change, but feminism's got to just stop, and we got to stop this LGBTQ stuff. Like, you can't achieve justice without being aware of the ways that injustice looks. And so, from a left-wing position like my own, you've got to be intersectional. You've got to be able to say, here is how this social problem affects trans people or black people or disabled people or whatever group that experiences marginalization and stuff and discrimination. And so that is one of for me, why, woke as a term, like, it needs to be certainly scrutinized and dissected, and it can't just be allowed to just like someone just blasé saying it. And because like the person you're describing, obviously I don't know him, I've never spoken to him. It'd be interesting to speak to him at some point, actually, from how you described it, because like he's a
great. I think you should have him on your show. He's a great conversationalist.
Well, I'll file that one away. Yeah. But they sound different to like, for me, the reason it irks me quite a lot is partly because, as I said earlier, it was lifted from black communities and turned into just this meme almost. But secondly, because the people using it with the loudest, like, it's all well and good people using it, and genuinely thinking they're talking about something specific, like, they've got critiques of academia or whatever, and that's one thing. But when it's being used as a shorthand for basically marginalized people I don't like, or things I don't like on in media and stuff, by people with millions of followers, or even active politicians, right? Because politicians use it now these days as well.
Right.
That is, for me, the issue and the greater problem. And I think the like, when we go even in thinking in terms of academia, like there's a reason that like when we're thinking about social science and stuff, like the reason that's, I study social science, right? And a lot of the authors you mentioned a second ago, Foucault and Nietzsche and stuff, like, they come up, right? But then of course they do, because if you're studying social science and you're studying like any sort of literature, really, of course people of that prominence are going to come up because they are core texts. But when you read when you're in those departments and stuff, like, from my experience, they of course teach those ones, but they also say there's a whole world of stuff. They do try and teach a broad like stuff beyond just Marx and stuff. I think there's inevitably going to be it's always tricky saying that, like, people say, the left-wing bias in academia and stuff. Like, to an extent, there's always going to be more, especially in social science, there's always going to be more critique of existing power structures, because when you study subjects which analyze the world, you're inevitably going to find problems, because nothing's perfect. And when things are built on centuries of really bad systems, it's not that long ago we had slavery, segregation, empires and stuff, World War II, all that sort of stuff. Of course there's going to be it's going to be more like left wing as such. But I don't think that it's necessarily, I feel like I'm just sort of defending academia, which is a whole other thing, right? I've got my critiques of it as well, but it's not and especially when a term like cultural Marxism as well. Like, I think when a term like that, which is so explicitly linked to the stuff that, like, and I'm not even going to exaggerate, like the stuff that the Nazis were saying, right? Cultural Bolshevism and stuff, and the really horrible, the communists are taking over universities and you've got to get them out and stuff. Like, I think that sort of speaks to why there's inherent distrust of why, the term woke being just everywhere. Because in the same way, it's like a dog whistle, right? It's a way of it's the same way DEI, like, and before that, critical race theory, just like other ways of saying black person, left-wing person I dislike. Like, they don't have to, and they've got someone who, if you spoke to them separately, probably would maybe even be an all right person, right? Like some Fox News viewer who probably is in a community that maybe engage with black people, and they're not like attending KKK rallies, but will see on the news, this politician is woke, this politician, they believe woke stuff. It's like they then are weaponized against them on a basis of nothing. In the same way that someone, if you actually describe to them the stuff that went, on my sociology course, if you actually like went through what we study with them, they'd think, oh, that's all right. Might not agree with it, but they might think, okay, well, I can see myself wanting to, being fine with this happening. But when it's filtered through a lens of, the extreme left taking over universities, like, of course they're going to maybe not react to it the best way, because it's how it's framed. And it also then centers the attention on people critiquing structures of power and making them out to be like the person who got scrutinized, and not the system of power, which has people and actors defending it who don't, like if you are someone that's being criticized by various academics, so let's say you're a member of government that's doing something that's being criticized, like, you have like a power mechanism to be able to, through the media and through politicians, like having a larger voice, right? Because they are literally in government, right? If you then start adopting the sort of reactionary terms, the focus is now back on the other, right? It's back on the academic, say, or even just the activist on Twitter or whatever who's used it, right? Or even just the person on Twitter, because let's not forget as well, anyone can be called an activist if you're advocating for something in society, right? Which is everyone at some point. It's who it gets applied to, which I think is important to take a look at.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much here I could say.
I
don't mind hanging on a bit longer unless you're needing me to hop.
I was just thinking, actually, I know we have a sort of rough timescale for this one.
Yeah.
It may be worth doing a part 2 at some point if you're up for it, just to...
Yeah, we haven't even touched on capitalism or academia. No, I would just look. I'm sympathetic to the idea that we see way too often influencers and politicians reducing complex ideas to simple scare words that motivate people to think one way or another of them, be it woke or DEI or critical race theory, or as you had mentioned earlier, the Red Scare. I would go further, and I don't know if you would agree or disagree with this, but I don't think that's a problem conducive to the right. I think the left can do it too. I think it is very common for the left to refer to something as hate or fascism when it may in fact not be that, because it triggers certain natural... It's like a shortcut to rather than having the argument, it's a way of labeling things. I also think that we humans are capable of more agency than we're often given credit for. Yes, there are those individuals watching Fox News late at night just screaming at their TV because of all those woke professors, but I don't think that's most of us. I think most of us are in fact capable of taking nuanced ideas and recognizing, I get mailers all the time from politicians saying, vote for me, I'm running against this woke person here that's supported by Bernie Sanders. It's like, I know that's complete nonsense. I know this person doesn't even know Bernie Sanders. They probably couldn't define woke for me, or if they could, it wouldn't. They couldn't explain why this person was or wasn't woke. Yes, there is a certain population that's going to be given into that, but I think what we're dealing with here, my broader concern, I guess I'm saying, is not that we have a scenario in which influencers and politicians are using shorthand that just stir up hate. It's that we have a situation in which we have a society that is low trust. It doesn't trust its institutions. It sees no merit in putting any faith in its politicians. Because if we had a society of a higher trust, who is more conducive to, say, more complex arguments, it wouldn't matter if people are out there screaming at us about the woke ideology or the fascists taking over. Most of us, I think, would have the capacity to listen to that, to give it, consideration, but also to listen to alternative views and then to make up our own minds. And so I'm completely for you in the sense that I don't want to exacerbate the problem. I want to be careful myself, and I know I've been guilty occasionally. I want to be careful myself of not just using words as sort of a scare tactic because it's got certain buzz factors. But I don't think that I don't think that the people themselves are necessarily just that much like sheeple, if you will. That just if we come up with the right buzzwords, it fixes all the problems. I think rather what we have is a low trust society, and that's why we're seeing these buzzwords being used as often as they are. The solution is not to completely get rid of the buzzwords. It's just to expect more out of the people, to call us to our better angels, to say, you know what, you can, in fact, learn this stuff for yourself. You don't have to just be dependent on what Fox News tells you. You can, in fact, investigate for yourself. And I think that's, honestly, I think that's what the mechanism of a free society is at the very root, right? That the individuals have to govern themselves in a capacity. They can't just rely on feelings and emotions. But anyhow, I'll let you continue on, because it sounds like you might want to wrap up, and I don't mean to open too many cans of worms.
It's got a little bit longer, I think. We're coming up to the 2 hour mark. Maybe that's a good sort of finish line of sorts. But no, there were some really interesting things there. I mean, I think there were a few points of contention with a little bit of it. Well, not just a little bit actually, but I think to expand on, so you're absolutely right. People, need to be more aware, but I think there's also intersections there with education, firstly, which are like the reason. Because you're right? It's not as though only right-wing people use like buzzwords and terms, but they're everywhere, all across the internet, all across.
But by the way, sorry to interrupt, but there was one point in my life when I got mail from both the Democrat and Republican national committees, and when you get these letters, it cracked me up because it was the exact same letter, it just had different buzzwords. It was insane. It's like this. They must think I'm an idiot. They just change out the buzzwords. So yeah, it's everybody does it.
I think, but yeah, like that speaks to. So firstly, we criticize why that is, right. The attention economy, horrible phrase by the way. Really don't like that. Just like the attention economy, but like that sort of clickbait, clicks mean you're doing well. Like that drives so much of stuff, and so rather than, as you said earlier, right, it takes more time and often gets less reward to be more thoughtful and calm and have a more long-winded explanation than to put out the most exclamatory, reactionary, hot take. And to go to sports for a second, just because I love sports, you see this in analysis, right? You could spend a bit of time thinking about why a football team or a football player is doing a certain way. You could sort of think about systems and be more thoughtful and sort of think about what could be going into a decision. Or you could put out some player X is garbage. They need to get fired from their team straight away. And it gets more views because you get people arguing about it. You get people getting cross about it. You get people like really latching onto that because they might also hate this player. And a whole, because other people see, that person, that pundit gets the most views, they get the most attention and clicks and stuff, and therefore, advertisers want to put their stuff on that post or tweet or whatever. Others start doing the same thing. It's like with YouTube thumbnails, right, where you get these like angry faces with massive text next to it, and like people do it not because they love that art style as much. I mean, maybe some do, but they want to get seen. They want to be picked up by it and stuff, and then it ends up influencing the whole sort of culture of it. And I think, and we're probably going to disagree on this, but I would say that is one of the many faults of the free market being sort of how we engage with, our sort of base engagement comes through and via the market. And when that starts influencing like media and social media, money starts going into it. And when you have money as like the driving force, it's like Twitter. It used to be sort of just like a space online where people put stuff and it starts gaining in traction, and there's lots of fun stuff you can do on there. And then suddenly brands start going onto it, and all of a sudden the hashtag trend is just filled with like corporate stuff and there's adverts all over it. And then you've got like view counters next to your tweets, like there's engagement, there's all sorts of stuff going into it now. And it's just like in my mind, it's almost unusable basically, because it's I'm not even going to touch the Elon Musk stuff, like that is ridiculous. But you know what I mean, like there's when we have the fact that people speak a certain way when we're talking about politics, a lot of them is not just by itself having come toward by itself. It's like it's a product of our both economy, our culture, like how people interact and stuff. And so that is crucial. And I think it's understanding why a term like woke can go from, can be sort of the way it is now, and not just woke, because it's not as though like you can guarantee there'll be another term when woke, because people sort of already say woke's a bit of a meme, right? Like people say, I think it, like, oh, that's woke, like they sort of know, but it's a bit silly, but it's still like being used and stuff. There'll be another term at some point that will come from somewhere that will have a similar effect. And I think when that gets said, when that term starts being used, whatever it is, people need to be aware of why these terms keep getting on. And I think it's also worth pointing out that with each of these terms, DEI, woke, CRT, all of them refer in some way to a margin, like critical race theory is a critique of how racial divisions and race is something which has been used to influence social structures and stuff and create power differences. Woke, a term that came from being aware of racial inequalities from Black communities. DEI, which is a series of policies designed to help and foster better representation of marginalized groups in America and stuff, right? Like they all link back in some way to groups that are directly in the crosshairs of the far right and such. And that isn't, I would not say that means everyone who uses it is in the far right, but I think it is important to say that it is the influence of sorts. I'll let you hand over, but we've got the last sort of 10-ish minutes or so.
Yeah, and
I apologize again. I've given you another huge chunk of stuff to try and respond to.
Well, and so I would hope that it depends on how we're defining terms. Obviously, I would hope that I myself do not. It's weird because I don't consider myself to be part of the far right as it's traditionally defined, but I also consider myself to be very conservative as far as like I take Edmund Burke serious, I take the classical tradition serious, and I think for that reason I am against MAGA America because I don't think it's conservative. I think it is populist. But I am also deeply critical of DEI, and I'm deeply critical of critical race theory, and I would say I'm deeply critical of woke, but that's such a broad topic as we're discussing that it's hard to say, okay, what does that mean? What exactly am I criticizing? And I'm critical of those systems because I think they fundamentally misidentify human nature. I think they offer value. Let me start there. I do think there is value at understanding how the power structures work. And is there a way in which power structures are producing results that are oppressive to minorities or to groups that don't have access to the power? But I also think that oftentimes they all suffer from a very similar over-reliance on trying to explain all of reality through power structures. Of trying to explain all systems through the haves and the have-nots, if you will. It's not that the haves and the have-nots don't exist. It's that I think human life is so much more beautiful and complex than that, that we can't, and I know you're not talking Marxism, but just to borrow that for a moment, that we can't reduce things to say like all material causes of somehow the entire history of the world is just a history of class struggle. No, it's not. Certainly, a history of class struggle is important and a very valuable part of the conversation. But the people I know and value in my life are so much more complicated than the class they're born into, or to the race they happen to be, or to their sexual identity. And I would even say they're more complicated than just saying them as an individual basis. It's a cacophony of the many things that make them them. And I think that's one of the things that I stand against in left-wing, and to be fair, a lot of right-wing circles also, is this kind of collapsing of the individual into, I want to assign you to these various groups so that I therefore know how to think of you in a larger power structure. This is what, when I was talking about Ryan, he wanted to be a therapist because he had almost committed suicide and he wants to help people doing the same thing. And yet he was running into people who, he said, look, presumably had the best of intentions. They also want to help people, but their understanding for helping people was we have to defeat the system, because it's the system that's the problem. Sure, you can help one person from committing suicide, but what good is that if the system is what's really oppressing them? And I think that while it is good and important to occasionally look at the system, I think that largely takes our eyes off the larger ball, which is I might not be able to do anything about the system, but I can help my neighbor down the street, and I can be a better person, and I can take care of things in my own life that are that are more eternal and honestly more meaningful than sort of viewing everything in a strict power political dynamic. And it occurs to me in saying any of this, it's probably a mistake because it's making it almost impossible for you to conclude without having to have some sort of a retort to that. But I'll give you an opportunity here so that we don't go too long today.
Well, I will say that I will add to what you said that it will be. I think it's absolutely noble and good to want to have perspective, right? And think, I can't change the world, so how can I make my life and my friends and family and neighbors' life better, right? Like, there are many things that happen in the world that need to change, and we can't change them with our own hands, right? And I think it's good to have perspective, right? Like it's even, I think, healthy to not fall into a rut because the world is awful. But I would posit that the systems being improved and being criticized and via the sort of lenses of CRT, and other left-wing and, let's say it, radical changes from what we have at the moment would make it easier to help people and would make it easier for us to be in our communities and celebrate what's good about life and stuff. I think that it's important to recognize that, as well as like helping each other is something which is both tangible and abstract, right? Like I can help my neighbors by taking the bins out and not leaving just rotting rubbish all over where I live. But I can also, we can all help each other by improving our energy. Like I feel like I'm starting off on a tangent again here already. Like, we can do small things to help improve the environment, like being responsible for our litter and recycling properly. But we also need to look at the systems, because ultimately, what good is me doing one little thing if BP and Shell oil can burn thousands of gallons of oil in a day or whatever? Like, I think that is why this difference in impact and weight and stuff is why it's important to have critiques of systems, which then come alongside the small things and influence and make it easier for the small things to have more weight, like in a more ultimately sort of left-wing thought, when we distill it down, is about making power more fairly distributed and promoting equality and fairness and stuff, which would make it easier for one person's actions to have more of an impact, because you're able to help people in a way that is more tangible, and you don't have the same pressures down on yourselves. But I'm aware that this is probably better served in a conversation about capitalism, the economy, all that sort of stuff. and I do not want. I'm as grateful and lovely as it's been talking to you. I don't want to drag on more. Well, it's not a drag. It's been nice. But eat up more and more time. So I will let you have a concluding statement of sorts before I sort of wrap things up, if you wanted to add anything else to.
I suck at concluding statements other than no, Owen, I appreciate the conversation, and I'm grateful you reached out to me. I mean, it's always good to talk. Honestly, it's good to talk to somebody who's across the pond, as we say, because the United Kingdom. I think the average American has a fascination with the United Kingdom. It's just it's the mother country, but it's so different. It's over there in that part of the world, and I swear half the time we think you're faking your accents. It's just you really talk like us. You're just putting on. But no, it's been a joy and a pleasure to talk to you. I don't know if we've made much progress here, but I'm happy to come on another time to try to figure out capitalism versus socialism. And I guess the only other thing I would say, just as a shameless plug, is check out Saving Elephants. You can find me on most podcast apps or on the YouTube channel. Probably need to type in Josh Lewis Saving Elephants, because YouTube has a lot of places trying to save the actual elephant, and I support that, but that's not me.
Well, no, it's been lovely talking with you. I do try. I have these conversations with various people of the political spectrum and such. I find them interesting. I think they're for me just a chance to hear different perspectives around the world. It's been nice just talking with someone in a fairly cordial manner, and especially because you said earlier about being conservative, being classical conservative. There's a lot of conservatives who are well off into. I mean, as with anything, conservative is both a noun and adjective that describes many different positions and things.
Mm-hmm.
And you get some. I mean, wouldn't say it describes me, but it depends on conservative. You're conserving something. What is being conserved, right? And I find that, I would not consider you on the far right because I've spoken to people who have really awful views and also can't talk without interrupting and being nasty in a hole. So I think whilst there is definitely probably some big disagreements coming up and in this conversation between us, it's still been nice just conversing and having this little debate. So yeah, it's as always, thank you for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening. I had a few viewers and nice stuff in the chat as well. At some point, we'll perhaps do part 2, but this will end the live show for today. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening.